Next, I'd like to introduce Mike Salvaris. I'm really fortunate that I get to work with him in a few different areas. Mike is the director of the Australian National Development Index. That's Andy. And also working on a Western Australia index that we call WADI. So we've got Andy and WADI. And he does many other things. He's been working in this area for 25 years to develop citizen-engaged goals and measurements of well-being, and has worked with many governments, Canada, Bhutan, New Zealand, and Australian governments to enact all this. So I'd like to welcome up Mike to speak to us today.
To change the slides, it's here, isn't it?
You can just ask them to change the slide if you want.
Okay. Oh, no, I'll try it. It's all right. Well, good morning, everyone. From one inept technologist to others who are probably more sophisticated than me. But what do we need to do to set Australia's wellbeing agenda over the next decade? My answer is simple. We must strengthen democracy and human rights, because these are the ultimate drivers of well-being in a rich but unequal country like Australia. Of course, we need better measures of progress once we've identified what progress our citizens actually want. And of course, we need better and smarter policies for well-being. But they can only go so far so long as structural inequality persists and democracy continues to decline. And sure, we need to measure what matters, but more importantly, as Kate Cheney said, we need to do what matters. Today, I want to invite you to see that the well-being of people is both an inherent and inseparable component of a strong democracy and an essential human right. And I will suggest that we in this movement must start to make more fundamental and forcible claims that equitable and sustainable well-being should be the overriding priority of our governments. Now, we may not have always recognised this, but democracy and well-being are bound together in many different ways, conceptually, practically, and operationally. Conceptually, because the idea that governments should promote the well-being of people, their health, security, housing, life opportunities, and so on, is an implicit assumption or part of the contract of democracy. It is what creates the political legitimacy for giving government power, and therefore it should be a principal priority of democratic governments in practice. Now, this idea goes a long way back in political thinking. As you can see there, Plato and Jefferson, and a more recent poll. And it's an idea that Australians believe in. It's a prime reason why they support democracy when we do surveys, and why they tend to re-elect governments that look after their well-being. This is a CPD-funded survey, I think. Practically, there are clear policy links between democratic governments and better well-being outcomes. 7 of the 10 most democratic countries are also in the 10 highest ranking for well-being. And operationally, when we think about and design well-being frameworks and policies, there are 6 crucial links that I want us to always be aware of between democracy and well-being in that task. Please take a minute to read them. They're all important. Now, there's another way that we can look at this relationship between democracy and well-being. As the third point on this list suggests, a healthy democracy is itself a key measure of a society's progress and well-being. This means that it's essential that our well-being frameworks and measurements define and measure the health of democracy itself in its own right. It's not easy, and certainly it's not popular with government, as we'll see, but it can be done. There are now many international and respected international indices of democratic health, and they tend to include factors such as these. This is a rather complicated diagram, but it's pretty comprehensive. And measuring democracy does produce some interesting results. Recently, the respected Economist Democratic Index downgraded America from the level of a full democracy to a flawed democracy because of its low levels of trust, poor electoral process, social polarisation, financial influence, and dysfunctional government and political parties. America was ranked 25th, just ahead of Estonia and Botswana. This enraged many Americans, accustomed to think of the USA as the world's democratic leader. But perhaps it isn't so surprising in a country of which it was said that the two greatest obstacles to democracy in the United States are, first, the widespread delusion among the poor that we have a democracy, and second, the chronic terror amongst the rich lest we get one. But we in Australia shouldn't be smug about this, because our own democracy, and those in many other countries, is not travelling very well, as a constant stream of research over the past decade has been showing. On 10 key measures, Australia's democracy is in decline. Take a second to look at this list. Each one of them is in decline. And there is increasing pessimism and distrust about our social and political system, especially amongst the young. Recently, a respected international survey, the Edelman Trust Barometer, suggested that we are becoming an increasingly divided and polarised nation, driven by a series of macro forces that are weakening the country's social fabric and creating increasing division in society. Much of this comes back to well-being, or the lack of it. Two of the main underlying causes for this situation appear to be growing inequality and economic unfairness, which in turn is eroding trust in government and our democratic system. As our highly respected international union expert Sharon Burrow, former ACTU leader, observed, national economies and the global economic model have failed working people and their families. To rebuild trust, people must be able to see how the wealth of their economy is being used to facilitate jobs, full employment, and equal economic participation of women and the inclusion of young people. And she didn't mention the environment, which she might well have added. So how do we fix our democracy? At its heart, democracy is about much more than simply voting for representatives. It's about building consensus around the kind of world we really want. But it's not a static phenomenon. It's not a museum piece, as we've been taught to see it. Like all good institutions, democracy must be dynamic. It needs innovation and change, and above all, trust to sustain it. It's interesting that a number of countries in relatively recent times have had national commissions of inquiry to examine the state of their democracies, including the UK, Ireland, Canada, Sweden, and Norway. Australia has not done this, despite a very vigorous recommendation to the Australia 2020 summit some years ago. When democracies are broken, ultimately it is not governments but citizens who can fix them, and they must want to do this. In a dynamic and creative democracy, there are many ways and many levels for citizens to do this, and many roles that they can have. Citizens in an active democracy are more than customers, which is the role that neoliberal governments assign to them. They can be many things, including auditors, co-providers of services, many things which we see in our daily lives. And there are considerable benefits for both government and the community from this engagement. That's a recent review, and here's a summary of those benefits. I think most of us would agree that one of the most important and meaningful tasks for citizens in a democracy is to help decide the future directions for their country's development and the key values and goals that should drive it. To decide, in effect, the kind of Australia that they want, And that is a task that I'm sure citizens want to be part of, provided the process is trusted and accessible. We surveyed citizens on this subject last year in our Andy Melbourne University project and found a very high proportion of citizens, the last statistic at the bottom, were keen to be part of such a process. However, when it comes to democracy compared to other dimensions of wellbeing, it's taken quite a while for governments to accept the key lessons which I mentioned. The OECD, which is itself an organisation of governments, is a good example. It held its first global forum in Palermo, Italy, in 2004 with a narrow focus on statistics and policy making. I was there, and at the end of the conference, Marilyn Waring and I, Marilyn from New Zealand, pointed to the lack of democracy and citizen engagement in the OECD's proposed wellbeing model. We were pretty sharply rebuked by the then Assistant Secretary General, who reminded us rather indignantly that the OECD was primarily an economic development organisation. However, we were lucky that the incoming Statistics Director, Enrico Giovannini, had other ideas, and 3 years later, at the Istanbul Forum, the new Secretary General's opening speech was entitled, "Measuring Progress, Does It Make a Difference for Policy Making and Democracy?" And since then, the OECD has in fact produced a wide range of reports and guidelines on democracy and citizen engagement in wellbeing and policy making. In Australia, the process has been somewhat slower. I need to say here, I think, that contrary to the claims of the current Treasury model, it was in fact the Australian Bureau of Statistics which actually developed Australia's first and internationally respected Wellbeing and Progress framework, measuring Australia's progress, which started in 1999, and I was on the original advisory committee, and that became the basis of the OECD's Better Life Index. But for all of its merits, the ABS was initially reluctant to include measures of democracy and good government. It was nervous. It believed that this area was complex, there wasn't enough data, and the bottom line was that governments didn't like it. But to its credit, the ABS did set up a strong community group, and this group, after several years, persuaded it to carry out a quite diverse and imaginative national community engagement program with fairly small resources over 2 years, 2011 to 2012, about what people thought was important for Australia's progress and wellbeing. The program included a range of different platforms, focus groups, surveys, social media, celebrity essays, radio and TV, and expert subject groups in each area. And on the basis of this input, the ABS included in its progress framework a major new section on governance, under which democratic progress would now be measured across 5 dimensions: trust, effective governance, participation, informed public debate, people's rights and responsibilities. Now, perhaps the most interesting, and to me certainly the bravest aspect of this community consultation was that instead of merely putting together a bunch of statistics for people to choose from, it asked Australians first about their aspirations for a good society. That was the title of an excellent report, which seems to have been buried now, entitled Aspirations for Our Nation, a conversation with Australians about progress. Sadly, this was a step too far. A year later, the whole program, 14 years of work, internationally respected, was defunded. So what has the current government learnt about these democratic lessons? The government's main project in this field, the Treasury's Measuring What Matters, was regarded as a reasonable start by some, but I think it can now be fairly criticised from several perspectives as considered as a democratic exercise. First, its community engagement process was narrow and hurried, mainly confined to written submissions by institutions. It put no significant resources into wider community engagement. There is not a lot of evidence that those submissions were listened to, especially those which urged the government to tackle some of the structural problems implicit in the paradigm of economic growth as progress, or to widen community engagement, or to build a different model of wellbeing into government. The Measuring What Matters Wellbeing framework is serviceable enough, but essentially it looks like to me, a fairly superficial refit of the OECD model and not a great improvement on the ABS's. From a democratic perspective, I think it has a few problems in terms of not including any serious attempt to measure democracy and human rights. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence, although there are promises still, to build this framework into government. These are more or less routine considerations in many other countries which have gone down the wellbeing path. It may be that the electoral focus on cost of living issues has swamped the Treasurer's reforming instincts, which were on vivid display about a couple of years ago. But it is beginning to look, to me at least, as though the government is saying it's been there and done that. We have to hope that this is only a temporary lapse. I think the exercise would have had a better chance of success if it had been undertaken as a whole of government effort informed by best practice in community engagement, because the importance of the issue itself certainly deserved this. And I hope my friends in Treasury will forgive me for saying this, but the Treasury has not in the past been the government agency most committed to community engagement or most knowledgeable about how to do it. In 2011, it had even gone so far as to criticise itself severely and for its self-confessed elitism. These are some extracts from the Treasury's report. It's fairly scathing, but I don't see a lot of evidence that the Treasury has learned from that. I hope that we are, in fact, just in a hiatus time. Now, I'm not going to talk about human rights a lot. I think it's self-evident that human rights are, in effect, a codification of wellbeing. That's what they exist for. And we should be more conscious of that, I think, in the work we do. So I'm going to finish. One point I wanted to make about Treasury and government consultation is that 2 years ago, a best practice manual was in fact produced, which the Treasury, I don't think, looked at, and most other agencies haven't used it. But it's an excellent report based on international work. A couple of federal government departments were representing Australia. So here is I've been asked to try and be concrete about what we need to do, what should be our agenda. I won't go through these, but these, to my mind, are some of the key changes that we need to see if we want to build an agenda for democratic wellbeing. Thank you.